HOA Karen didn't just cross a line, she shattered my family's world. When her reckless actions broke my disabled daughter's spine, she thought she'd gotten away with it. What she didn't know? I wasn't just another homeowner. I was the assistant commissioner, and this was far from over. It all started with a seemingly minor complaint from the HOA about the appearance of my yard. The letter I received was typical for the neighborhood. Another trivial note about trimming the hedges or cleaning up the lawn. It wasn't the first time the HOA had flexed its muscle over something that didn't really matter, but this time, it felt different. The tone in the letter was sharper, more insistent, and it felt like they were pushing harder than usual. I knew they could be unreasonable, but this was beginning to feel personal. The real issue, however, wasn't about the yard. It was about the way the HOA had been overstepping its bounds in our neighborhood for months. They'd been making waves with their relentless inspections, arbitrary fines, and power-hungry attitude. Neighbors had already started to complain, feeling as though they were being constantly watched and judged. And this time, I wasn't going to let them walk over me, especially not when the situation could easily spiral out of control. Karen, the HOA enforcer, had been the one to deliver the last letter. She had a reputation in the neighborhood, one that preceded her wherever she went. People knew her for her overzealous enforcement of rules, her rigid attitude, and her ability to turn the smallest infraction into a full-blown issue. She was the one who showed up with a clipboard in hand, ready to pounce on anything she deemed out of line. In her eyes, the entire neighborhood was just a checklist of violations waiting to be written up. On the day she arrived, I wasn't expecting much more than a brief conversation. I had already taken care of the yard issues she'd mentioned, but I figured this was just another formality to check off the HOA's list. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly everything would escalate. Karen walked up to my door with an air of superiority that immediately rubbed me the wrong way. She didn't greet me or make any small talk. She just started reading off the issues in her usual condescending tone. The words she spoke weren't new. They were the same complaints that had been echoing throughout the neighborhood for months. What set this interaction apart, however, was the way she spoke about my daughter. My daughter, who had been in her wheelchair for several years, was sitting near the front door, quietly watching as Karen delivered her critique of our property. She had learned to live with her condition and had always been a trooper about dealing with the limitations of her disability. She didn't often go out into the yard, but on that day, she had been excited to move her chair out of the way to let Karen pass. But Karen didn't notice. She didn't care about the inconvenience my daughter faced, or the fact that she was already struggling to manage the simple task of moving her wheelchair. Karen was too focused on finishing her inspection. She didn't stop to acknowledge that my daughter was trying to move, instead pushing past her as if she were just another obstacle in the way. In her haste to finish the task at hand, Karen's frustration mounted. She was annoyed that we hadn't fixed every single issue she'd flagged, and in her anger, she knocked into my daughter's wheelchair. The sudden impact sent my daughter toppling sideways, her fragile body slamming against the ground in a painful, jarring motion. The fall was violent, and I could see the shock and pain on my daughter's face as she crumpled to the ground. It happened so quickly that it took me a moment to process what I had just witnessed. 1 minute, Karen was standing with her clipboard, and the next, my daughter was lying helplessly on the concrete, unable to move. My first instinct was to rush to her, but I could barely make sense of what had just happened. Karen, on the other hand, didn't even pause. She didn't show an ounce of concern for what she had done. Instead, she muttered something about needing to finish the inspection and continued going over her list of complaints. The pain in my daughter's eyes was unbearable, and yet Karen was too preoccupied with ticking off boxes on her list to notice or care. I reached my daughter, my hands shaking as I helped her sit up, but the look on her face was enough to make my blood boil. She wasn't crying out of fear or pain. She was crying because she knew something was seriously wrong. Her spine was injured, and she couldn't move the way she normally did. There was a deep, uncomfortable stillness in her body that I'd never seen before. In that moment, the reality of the situation hit me like a wave. This wasn't just about a yard or an HOA violation anymore. This was about my daughter's well-being and Karen's callous disregard for her safety. But as I tried to comfort my daughter, Karen just kept going on about the important issues that needed to be addressed. She didn't even stop to apologize. The woman who had caused my daughter's injury didn't even have the decency to acknowledge the damage she had done. I could feel my anger building, but I kept my composure. I had to think clearly. This wasn't just a minor incident, it was something far more serious. Karen had crossed a line, and she was going to learn the consequences of her actions. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that I wasn't just another frustrated homeowner. I was someone with the authority and power to hold her, and the entire HOA accountable. And I wasn't going to let this go. The moment we arrived at the hospital, time seemed to slow. The bright lights of the emergency room, the hurried steps of medical staff, and the overwhelming sense of urgency, everything felt surreal. My daughter, typically so strong and composed, was now lying in that sterile hospital bed, helpless. The doctors and nurses immediately began assessing her condition, but the look on their faces told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just another injury. This was serious. They worked quickly, stabilizing her and running tests, trying to get a clearer picture of the damage. It felt like an eternity before they finally gave us the grim news. My daughter had suffered a severe spinal injury. The impact of the fall had caused damage that would leave her immobilized, potentially for the rest of her life. As a father, it was devastating to hear. My mind reeled as I thought about all the things she would no longer be able to do. Simple, everyday things that many people take for granted. I could feel the weight of her pain, the frustration in her eyes as she realized her world was being irrevocably altered. This wasn't just a physical injury, it was a blow to her spirit, her independence, and her sense of self. Watching her struggle, unable to move without assistance, was something no parent should ever have to endure. The emotions that came with the diagnosis were overwhelming. Anger, sadness, helplessness, they all blended together into an almost suffocating fog. But amid all the pain and grief, there was something deeper, something that gnawed at me with a growing intensity. The realization that this injury hadn't come from an accident. It wasn't some random, unforeseen event. My daughter had been hurt because of the reckless actions of someone who should have known better. Someone who should have been responsible enough to stop, to think, and to treat her with the respect and care she deserved. Karen, the HOA enforcer, had been the one who knocked my daughter over in her haste, her frustration clouding any sense of empathy. She wasn't some well-meaning person who made an unfortunate mistake. This wasn't a simple misstep. No, Karen's actions had been careless, inconsiderate, and downright dangerous. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. The real sting wasn't just the physical damage Karen had caused, it was the realization that her behavior was not an isolated incident. She was a part of a larger, more toxic system that had been overstepping its bounds for far too long. The HOA had long been known for its overzealous enforcement of arbitrary rules and regulations, constantly pushing boundaries and creating conflict within the community. It was never just about keeping the neighborhood nice or orderly. No, it was about control. The HOA had been using its power to intimidate and belittle homeowners for years, making unreasonable demands and enforcing unnecessary fines. Karen wasn't just a rogue enforcer. She was a product of a broken system, one that valued authority over empathy, rules over people. And now, that system had caused my daughter's injury. As the reality of the situation set in, I realized how deep the problem ran. It wasn't just about Karen's actions in that moment. It was about the larger culture of entitlement and disregard for others that the HOA had fostered. They saw themselves as a power structure above the residents, as people who could dictate every aspect of our lives. The neighborhood wasn't a community to them. It was a place to exert control, to wield authority without accountability. And now, it had gone too far. Karen's casual dismissal of what she had done, her inability to even acknowledge the harm she had caused, was a symptom of that larger issue. The HOA wasn't about making the neighborhood a better place. It was about enforcing conformity, about controlling every little aspect of our lives. And when someone like Karen was given that much power, bad things happened. In this case, those bad things were personal. It wasn't just about a violation or a fine. It was about my daughter's future, her well-being, and her ability to live a full, independent life. At that moment, it became clear that I couldn't just sit back and let this slide. The system that had allowed this to happen needed to be held accountable. Karen's actions, while terrible, were just one example of how the HOA had been operating, unchecked. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't an isolated issue. Other families had been subjected to the same kind of power plays, the same overbearing attitude, and the same disregard for the well-being of individuals. I wasn't just angry. I was motivated. This wasn't just about my daughter anymore. This was about standing up to an unjust system, one that had used its authority to harm and intimidate innocent people for far too long. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of my daughter's injury became clearer. Every physical therapy session was a reminder of the long road ahead, and the emotional toll it took on our family was profound. But with every new step in the healing process, I became more resolute in my decision to fight back. I knew that the HOA had to pay for what they had done. They needed to be held responsible, not just for my daughter's injury, but for the damage they had inflicted on the entire community. It was time to make sure that Karen, the HOA, and anyone else who thought they could act with impunity learned that there were real consequences for their actions. When the doctors confirmed the extent of my daughter's injuries, something inside me shifted. The shock and grief had given way to a focused resolve. I knew that I couldn't just accept the situation as it was. This wasn't a case of bad luck or a random accident. It was the result of someone's reckless disregard for human life. I couldn't let that slide. At that moment, I realized that in order to get justice for my daughter, I had to change the dynamics that had allowed people like Karen to operate with impunity. The HOA had been abusing its power for too long, and they thought they could continue doing so without consequences. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't just another frustrated homeowner. They had no idea who I truly was or what I was capable of. Karen might have seen me as just another nuisance in her neighborhood inspection rounds, but what she didn't know was that I held a position of significant power and authority. I wasn't just someone who could file a lawsuit or make noise. I had the tools to effect real change, and I wasn't afraid to use them. I was the Assistant Commissioner for Local Law Enforcement, a role that carried with it not just influence, but a level of authority that would make people take notice. I knew the ins and outs of the system better than most, and I had the connections and resources to navigate the legal landscape with precision. This wasn't just about my daughter's injury anymore. It was about holding an institution accountable for its actions. The HOA had acted recklessly, and they had been operating under the illusion that they could do whatever they wanted without anyone challenging them. I would make sure that illusion was shattered. The power dynamics in this neighborhood were about to change. To begin with, I started gathering evidence. A lawsuit would be necessary, but it wasn't just about suing the HOA. I wanted to expose the full extent of their negligence and abuse of power to the public. I wasn't going to let Karen's actions be swept under the rug, and I wasn't going to let the HOA continue to bully homeowners without facing consequences. I wanted to make sure that people knew exactly what had happened and how they had hurt my daughter. I began by documenting everything. The incident itself was clear. Karen's carelessness had caused my daughter's injury, but I knew that would only be the beginning. I started to collect records from the HOA, including past complaints, inspection reports, and any evidence that could demonstrate a pattern of abuse. My experience as assistant commissioner meant that I had access to resources most people didn't. I knew how to request and interpret public records, how to find inconsistencies in paperwork, and how to build a case that would be hard to refute. But I wasn't just gathering evidence for a lawsuit. I wanted to create a public reckoning. I started reaching out to neighbors and community members who had been impacted by the HOA's overreach. I knew there were others who had been victimized by Karen's heavy-handed tactics, and I wanted to make sure their voices were heard. I wasn't going to let the HOA operate in the shadows, making arbitrary decisions that hurt families without facing any repercussions. As I dug deeper into the HOA's history, I uncovered troubling details that only fueled my determination. The HOA had long been an institution that wielded power without accountability. From exorbitant fines for minor infractions to unfair restrictions on homeowners, the organization had been operating as though it were above the law. They had pushed homeowners to their breaking points, threatening legal action, making unreasonable demands, and abusing their authority in ways that went far beyond what was acceptable. What bothered me even more was the way the HOA operated as a self-contained entity, insulated from any real scrutiny. Homeowners had little recourse when they were wronged, and most people were too intimidated by the HOA's power to fight back. Karen was just one example of the type of enforcer the organization had cultivated. People who believed they were above reproach, who saw homeowners as nothing more than obstacles to be dealt with. I had seen this kind of abuse of power before in my law enforcement career, but it was always different when it happened to your own family. It became clear to me that I couldn't just go through the motions. I couldn't just file a complaint and hope for the best. The HOA had to be forced into the public eye, and the only way to do that was to hit them where it hurt. Their reputation and power were everything to them. If I could expose them as the hypocrites and abusers they were, it would be the beginning of the end for their unchecked authority. I started working on a plan. I knew that as the assistant commissioner, I had a unique position to challenge the HOA's power. I wasn't just a homeowner with a grievance. I was a person with real influence, someone who could make waves. I started to draft a complaint that would hold both Karen and the HOA responsible, not just for my daughter's injury, but for their entire approach to governance. It wasn't going to be enough to just hold Karen accountable. I wanted to make sure that the entire system was reformed. By this point, I was no longer just focused on my daughter's injury. I was focused on making sure that no other family would have to go through what we had endured. I was going to use my position to bring real change to the neighborhood. It was time for the HOA to face the consequences of their actions, and I was going to make sure they never operated with this level of unchecked power again. The game had changed, and the power shift was about to make waves far beyond my own neighborhood. The moment I filed the complaint, I knew it wouldn't be an easy fight. The HOA, with its vast resources and influence, wasn't going to back down without a fight. Their first move was predictable. They tried to downplay the situation, dismissing it as nothing more than a freak accident. They tried to paint Karen as an unfortunate bystander caught in a series of mishaps, hoping to avoid responsibility and maintain the illusion of their untouchability. But I wasn't fooled, and I wasn't going to let them sweep it under the rug as they had done, with countless other complaints over the years. This wasn't just about my daughter's injury. It was about exposing the corrupt and reckless behavior that had been allowed to thrive within the HOA for far too long. I knew that to bring real justice, I had to approach this case methodically, with every step carefully planned and executed. The HOA may have thought they could intimidate me with their lawyers and bureaucracy, but I was no stranger to navigating complex legal systems. As assistant commissioner, I had dealt with countless cases involving power dynamics and abuses of authority, and I had the tools and connections to make sure this case didn't get buried. I immediately brought in a team of investigators to gather every shred of evidence I could. This wasn't just about proving Karen's culpability. This was about shining a light on the entire system that had allowed her, and others like her, to act with impunity. The first order of business was to ensure that every document and piece of evidence was in order. I combed through the HOA's records, looking for past complaints against Karen, looking for patterns in the way the HOA handled issues of misconduct. What I found was shocking, but not entirely surprising. The HOA had a long history of covering up incidents like this. Karen's reckless actions weren't isolated. They were part of a broader culture of overreach and disregard for the well-being of homeowners. The more I dug, the more I realized that the HOA had allowed a toxic environment to fester, a place where those in positions of power felt entitled to treat residents however they saw fit, without fear of repercussions. But I wasn't going to let them hide behind their legal teams. I knew that the key to breaking through their defenses was to expose their pattern of behavior, to show that this wasn't just a one-time mistake, but a systemic issue that needed to be addressed. I wasn't just fighting for my daughter's injury anymore. I was fighting for the rights of every homeowner who had ever been silenced or ignored by the HOA. Every resident who had been threatened with fines, bullied into submission, or forced to comply with arbitrary rules that had no basis in fairness. This was about holding the HOA accountable for the damage they had caused, not just to my family, but to the entire community. In the days following the filing of my complaint, the HOA's legal team scrambled to defend their position. They tried to claim that Karen had acted within the scope of her duties, that her actions were justified under HOA rules. But as I dug deeper into the details of the case, I realized that their defense was weak, built on a foundation of lies and half-truths. They couldn't justify what had happened, not when there was clear evidence that Karen's behavior had gone beyond what could be considered reasonable. In fact, it was clear that Karen had acted recklessly, with little regard for the safety of others, and the HOA had failed to take any action to address her behavior, despite previous complaints. But the legal battle was far from over. The HOA's legal team was relentless, and they had the resources to drag out the process, making it as difficult as possible for me to move forward. They attempted to intimidate me with lengthy court proceedings, hoping that the stress and financial strain would force me to back down. But I wasn't going to be intimidated. I had the law on my side, and I had the backing of the truth. Every day, I grew more determined to make sure this case wasn't just another one of the HOA's many successful cover-ups. I wasn't going to let them win. One of the most frustrating parts of this legal battle was the way the HOA tried to shift the blame onto me and my family. They tried to argue that we had somehow been responsible for the incident, that we had somehow provoked Karen's behavior or had failed to follow the rules. They were grasping at straws, trying to create a narrative that would absolve them of responsibility. But I wasn't about to let them twist the facts. I knew the truth, and I was prepared to fight for it. I made it clear to the HOA that I wasn't interested in a settlement. They had offered to pay for my daughter's medical bills, but that wasn't enough. I wasn't just fighting for compensation. I was fighting for justice. I wanted the entire HOA to be held accountable for what they had allowed to happen. I wanted Karen to face consequences for her reckless actions, and I wanted the HOA to be forced to change the way they operated. No longer would homeowners be subject to the whims of an organization that believed it was above reproach. The legal system would expose the flaws in their operations, and I would be the one to lead the charge. As the case progressed, it became clear that the HOA's defense was crumbling. The evidence I had gathered was irrefutable. The truth had a way of coming to light, and the more we revealed, the more the HOA's actions were exposed for what they truly were: abuses of power. They couldn't hide behind their legal team forever. Eventually, the pressure began to mount, and the HOA had no choice but to start considering the consequences of their actions. I wasn't going to stop until they paid the price for what they had done to my daughter, and for the countless other families they had hurt in the process. The legal battles had been long and grueling, testing my resolve at every turn. But momentum was shifting. The pressure that had been mounting on the HOA could no longer be ignored. The evidence, the testimonies, and the undeniable facts had created a tidal wave of accountability that the HOA was ill-equipped to face. Karen, once an enforcer of their unjust rules, now found herself at the center of it all, her actions exposed for what they truly were: reckless, irresponsible, and harmful. The HOA had initially tried to spin the incident, portraying it as a freak accident, something that could happen to anyone anywhere, but they had underestimated the power of truth and the relentless pursuit of justice. No amount of spin or legal maneuvering could obscure the fact that Karen had overstepped her bounds. She wasn't just a minor player in this drama. She was the catalyst, the embodiment of everything that was wrong with the HOA. She had violated multiple codes, ignored warnings, and caused irreparable harm to my daughter. The damage wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological, and had left scars that would take years to heal. The legal team that represented the HOA did their best to drag out the process, hoping that with time, the case would lose its bite. They counted on the fact that most people would tire of the fight, accept the settlements, and move on. But this wasn't just about money or compensation for my family. This was about making sure that the HOA knew the full weight of their actions and understood that there would be real consequences for what they had done. And the truth was, the longer the case dragged on, the more the HOA realized that they couldn't escape the reckoning that was coming for them. Finally, after months of legal wrangling, the HOA began to feel the pressure. The public outcry was growing. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out against the HOA's reign of terror now found their voices, emboldened by the truth. The media had picked up on the story, and the HOA's reputation was starting to crumble. They couldn't hide behind their walls of bureaucracy any longer. The longer they resisted, the more their own hypocrisy became apparent. In a last-ditch attempt to avoid a court trial, the HOA agreed to settle. The deal was substantial: a large compensation package for my daughter, medical expenses covered, and damages for the trauma she had endured. On the surface, it seemed like a victory. But I knew better than to let them off the hook so easily. Money wasn't the answer to everything. I knew that unless the underlying issues were addressed, unless the very system that allowed Karen and others like her to operate without consequence was dismantled, this would just be another case swept under the rug with no real change. I made it clear that this settlement came with stipulations, the first of which was a complete overhaul of the HOA's management structure. This wasn't just about punishing Karen. It was about sending a clear message that the culture of abuse and power-hungry officials had no place in the community. The leadership that had allowed this situation to go on unchecked for so long had to be held accountable. The settlement stipulated that anyone who had been complicit in the events leading up to my daughter's injury, anyone who had enabled the toxic environment within the HOA, would be removed from their positions. No one who had failed to protect the residents could continue in their roles. The power structure that allowed Karen's actions to go unchallenged had to be dismantled. As for Karen herself, the final blow came swiftly and decisively. She was terminated from her position, her career within the HOA destroyed by her own actions. There was no room for leniency when someone's actions had caused irreparable harm to a child. It wasn't just a job for Karen. It had been her position of power, her ability to control and dominate the people who lived in her neighborhood. But that power had been stripped from her, and now she would face the consequences of her carelessness. She would no longer be able to bully families or enforce rules that only benefited her and her cronies. But the most important part of this entire process wasn't the compensation, the public apology, or even Karen's termination. It was the precedent this case set. This was a victory not just for me, but for anyone who had ever been victimized by a corrupt HOA system. The fight wasn't just about my daughter's injury. It was about ensuring that future generations wouldn't have to endure the same kind of tyranny. It was about reminding the HOA that they were not above the law and that the people they claimed to serve had the power to hold them accountable. Every time Karen, or anyone else from the HOA, tried to act like they still had control, I reminded them who truly had the authority in this neighborhood. The power had shifted. No longer would they be able to intimidate and bully the residents into silence. No longer would they be allowed to abuse their power without fear of repercussions. The community had been given back its voice, and the days of unchecked HOA rule were over. As the settlement was finalized, I knew that this was only the beginning. The HOA had been forced to reckon with the consequences of their actions, but the work was far from finished. The entire HOA system would have to be restructured, transparency had to be prioritized, and future abuses had to be prevented. But the battle we had fought and won would echo for years to come. The message was clear. No one is untouchable, and when you cross the line, there are real consequences. The HOA had learned that lesson the hard way, and so had Karen. If you found this story as shocking as I did, make sure you're subscribed to the HOA Stories for more explosive tales of homeowners standing up against corrupt HOA tyrants. Don't let these abuses go unnoticed. Share this video and join the fight for fairness in every neighborhood. Hit that notification bell because you won't want to miss the next battle for justice. Stay tuned, and remember, no one is above the law, not even the HOA.